My team and I profitably managed over $700,000 a month in ad spend for a B2C regenerative medicine company. And today's video is going to be part one in a series of lessons that we learned in doing so. If you're new to the channel, my name is Sebastian Robeck. I have worked as the previous CMO for Cole Gordon and Closers.io. I was also the head of marketing for a multi-8-figure regenerative medicine company, which is the company I'm going to be referencing here in today's video. And current day, my team and I here at 7FM help high-ticket info brands scale from being stuck at a few $100,000 a month up to multiple 6 and 7 figures a month. And we do it consistently, profitably, and in a way where the founders aren't losing their minds. So without further ado, let's get right into today's video. So again, this is going to be part one in a sort of mini series here on the YouTube channel. And in today's specific video, I'm going to be covering the media buying side of managing over $700,000 a month. As you could probably imagine, $700,000 a month in ad spend, especially in the way it was distributed, which I'm about to show you here in a second, is no small task. It requires systems, processes, and an incredibly high attention to detail. I'm going to walk you through what all that looks like. And specifically in this video, I'm going to be covering the ad account structure that we used, what ads and messaging work the best, our daily and weekly trend analysis process, and how we identified what our baseline KPIs needed to be, the metrics that actually mattered, and when to trim, cut, and scale campaigns inside the ad account. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about compliance, because that's an incredibly crucial part of all of this. And by the way, just as a little bit of a teaser here, the following videos within this mini-series are going to cover things like how I synced up as the director of marketing with the sales team, and how we built a bridge between marketing and sales, which is also absolutely vital. In a future video here, I'm also going to talk about tracking and attribution at this level of spend. How we built monthly targets is going to be its own video. And then lastly, I'm going to go over how we diversified our conversion and client acquisition to maintain profitability at this level. So let's get into the media buying side for today's video. To preface this, I just want to walk you through some of the challenges that we ran into at this level. Again, as you can imagine, when you're at this size, there's a lot more complexity. And as a result, there's just more roadblocks that are in the way. So at $700,000 a month in spend, you cannot rely on one campaign or one ad. You can't be sort of one-trick ponied, if you will. In order to maintain that level of spend profitably, you have to have an entire ecosystem. And that was one of the big focuses of ours. And quite frankly, it was one of the things that was a relatively ongoing challenge for us to continue to build and maintain. Because again, 700 grand a month in spend spread across 3 different B2C offers. There's just a lot of complexity, but we did it and we made it work. But again, I'm just outlining what the challenges were. You also need multiple angles. You need different audiences. You need different approaches. Again, this kind of goes into the first point I just mentioned, which is you cannot be sort of one-trick ponied at this level of spend. Platform risk is huge. And with one of our offers in particular, this was an ongoing issue, specifically when it came to ad account rejections, because of the nature of the industry that we were in, the delicacy of medical, anything medical really, especially on Facebook, as a lot of you probably know. And so the risk of being over-reliant on one traffic source, one form of client acquisition, again, is huge and was for us. And at this level, risk management became far more important than just crushing our numbers, because as you scale to this level of spend, you're going to naturally see your performance decline. And what becomes, again, far more important is actually having the ability to continue running ads rather than trying to always be aiming for getting the absolute best numbers in the world, which isn't always necessarily attainable when you're spending 10, 15 grand a day plus on one single offer and one traffic source. So things like reducing the amount of ad rejections that we have in the account, regularly cleaning up the ad accounts, and removing old rejections and old things that just don't even need to be in the account and raise the risk of the account being flagged. Those things become even more important at this scale. And the last challenge here is that attribution gets really messy at this spend level as well, as you could probably imagine. I will touch on that. Okay, so let's get into the ad account structure and exactly how we manage $700,000 a month in ad spend. So a lot of you watching this video here, and a lot of you that are seeing the videos on this channel, if I had to guess, you're probably the founder of a high-ticket info business. And again, I'm just taking a wild guess. You probably aren't managing more than 100 to 150,000 a month in paid traffic. I could be wrong. I don't know exactly the kinds of people watching these videos, but that's my best guess. And you might be wondering, well, man, at 700 grand a month in spend, the ad account structures must be incredibly complex, right? The truth, however, is that not necessarily the case. Sometimes there's a bit of added complexity depending on how much new stuff we might be testing, or if we have to aggressively scale the budget, that can add some complexity depending on sales team capacity. But the truth is, at a high level, generally speaking, the structure of our ad account, like the types of campaigns we were running, how those campaigns were architected out, the complexity level was really not that high. What becomes much more important at this scale, rather than the complexity or lack thereof inside the ad account itself, is the actual set of processes you have around the ad account that allow you to analyze trends and data week over week, and the process that you have for making decisions. That becomes far more important than, how many campaigns you have or the types of campaigns or whatever. Of course, those things matter, like it's without a doubt, but it's even more important to have a really, really rock solid process by which you make decisions on what's inside the ad account. So at a macro level, our spend distribution looked like this. We had 3 offers within the entire company. 95% of our paid traffic was on Facebook. The other 5% was on some branded Google search. That obviously was a minority of our spend, so it wasn't a big revenue driver. 95% of the spend was on Facebook, and that was our bread and butter. So the way we allocated budget inside the ad account, again, it would fluctuate. So take this with a little bit of nuance here, because this would change depending on where we were at in a given month, or what changes we might make to our targets depending on sales team capacity and all that. But generally speaking, we allocated the budget as follows. So we would have roughly 70% of our total budget going to proven winners. So this is, campaigns that we know worked, creatives that we know work. For the most part, these core winning campaigns were higher budget CBO, so 3, 4, 5 grand a day CBO campaigns with usually between 2 to 4 ad sets inside those campaigns, and those ad sets would usually be a mix of open targeting, so literally just letting Facebook's algorithm do its thing and have the creative do most of the quote-unquote targeting for us. And then sometimes we'd have some bigger, broader interests in there as well. What I found, generally speaking, with media buying, especially on Facebook, this is not the case on YouTube, by the way. YouTube's a whole other beast, which I will talk about in other videos. But with Facebook, highly segmented and targeted interests are just becoming far, far less effective. You've probably heard this from other marketers online, and it's true. The effectiveness of even lookalikes is starting to dwindle a bit. So what we're finding to work the best, and this was definitely the case here in this company, was just broader targeting, and again, letting the creatives really do the heavy lifting. We would also include some retargeting here to some of our higher intent audiences, people who filled out an application but didn't book a call. Even sometimes we do book a call but didn't show. So we'd show content retargeting and even some conversion-based retargeting ads to those audiences as well. Again, high budget CBO was the actual type of campaign that this 70% of budget would go into. Then we'd have 20% of budget going into tests and scaling some of those tests. So this would be expanding what worked in our initial testing phase, which is where 10% of our budget typically would go to. Again, depending, there were some periods of some months where our budget to proven winners was lower, because maybe we needed to refresh our creatives and we needed 30% to go to testing. So it just depends contextually on where you're at. But generally speaking, this is where we landed. So again, 20% would go to scaling some of these tests. So these would be things like new, broader interests for some of our winning creatives, testing local targeting, which we did quite a bit of and actually worked quite well because we had physical locations in different cities. We would do placement testing. So this was a big bearer of fruits for us. We would have a mix of some campaigns would work really well with auto placements, so Advantage Plus placements. Other campaigns would actually work a lot better when we just isolated to, say, for example, Facebook and Instagram feeds, or we would do vertical only ads specifically on Facebook and Instagram stories and Instagram Reels. That also worked really well. And this budget was typically spread across just mid-budget ABO ad sets. So we usually have 1, maybe 2 ABO campaigns. Typically, it would just be 1 campaign, and then within that campaign, we'd have several different ad sets. So it was all ABO budget, and typically between 250 to 400 a day is what we would start testing at. And then that would be like per ad set. And then again, 10% of our total budget usually went to innovation. So this is just new stuff, basically testing new angles, totally different pockets of audiences. And again, this would usually be lower budget ABO, so maybe $100 to $200 a day to test some new creatives and new angles. The reason this split is so important is because what a lot of people try and do is they try to have 50%, or sometimes even they'll flip it and they'll go 80-20%, with 80% going to testing, 20 to scaling. The problem is that if you do that, especially at this level, you're gonna completely wreck your ROAS, and you're gonna screw with the sales team's opportunity volume, which is probably even more important. I mean, of course, it's all intertwined, but at this level, what you really need is you need stability. And so as marketers, we always want to be testing things. We always have a million ideas at any given point, right? But it's really a game of discipline and understanding that you can test all of those things within time, and not getting too aggressive with the testing, because if you suddenly shift your budget allocation to 50-50, if your ad account now is testing and you're spending 15 grand a day, well, that's $7,500 a day that's going to stuff that may or may not work, which ultimately trickle down effect is that, again, opportunity for the sales team is going to be significantly hindered, and you're kind of cutting the sales team off at the knees, if you will, because you're testing too much. So we tried to steer away from that as much as we could. However, of course, you do always need to be constantly testing to find new winners, new opportunities, new pockets, different angles, different faces on the ads, that sort of thing. So you still need to be doing that. It's just a matter of doing that within reason, so you don't sacrifice the overall ROAS of your accounts. And this, generally speaking, this 70-20-10 split would typically work the best for us to keep cash flow stable while we were scaling. So let's talk about ads and messaging and what worked the best. So again, you might be pretty surprised here. Simplicity scales, complexity fails. I know it's a cliche. I know it's a foundational sort of teaching, but it really is true. And it was very, very true here with us, and couldn't apply more. So our best ads at a very, very high level there were kind of three buckets that we had. So bucket number one was pain point focused ads. So I'll give you an example. One of our offers was an offer in the sort of hair loss / hair regrowth market. And I won't go too deep into what the actual offer was. It's not really relevant. But I'll give you an example of our sort of a micro segment of that market that worked really, really well. Was basically guys who were, usually in their 40s or 50s, and they were already seeing pretty significant hair loss. It was extremely diminishing to their confidence, completely wrecked their self-image. They started wearing hats. They didn't even want to go outside sometimes because they just didn't want to be seen as a totally different person than who they were in their 20s, because now their hair's, halfway gone, or sometimes even more. And so really hitting on those pains and then positioning our offer as sort of this new sexy revolutionary thing that could actually change the game for their hair regrowth was probably the best performing set of angles and messaging. So really hitting hard on that pain point. A sort of sub point here that worked really well within these pain point focused ads was leveraging scientific studies. So this was a really, really big pillar for us. So there's obviously a million and one ways you can deploy proof in your marketing and in your messaging. You can use social proof in the form of your actual client testimonials. Now, when it comes to using client or patient testimonials, as I've mentioned, and as you could probably imagine, compliance here was huge. And so we had to be very mindful and careful with how we used actual patient testimonials. So we tended to steer on the safer side of things. And so what that meant was we had to find other forms of proof to use. So again, that could be your own clients. It can also be external third-party versions of proof. So it could be, hey, this big news outlet or this big article said this about this thing or whatever. In our case, what really helped was referencing actual scientific studies and clinical trials that showcase the efficacy of the sorts of therapies that we were promoting. So that, in tandem with hitting hard on the pain points, was incredibly effective. We also found that education-based ads worked really, really well. And these are all types of ads and messaging that, if you're watching this as a founder of a high-ticket info business, I would highly recommend you start testing some of these. I've talked in another previous video about using pain point focused style ads and really hitting on a person's experience. So you're probably already familiar with that. If you're not doing that, I would, again, highly suggest you do. I would also recommend testing these education-based ads. So we would literally just talk about how our process works, what to expect during treatment. We would kind of go into this, how this new breakthrough method is helping people do X, Y, and Z. We also found these sort of podcast style FAQ ads to work incredibly well. Some of our top performing ads, actually, along with the pain point focused ones, were vertically filmed podcast style ads where, where the founder or our team, we'd have them be on camera and they would basically be answering one or two commonly asked questions that people give us about our different protocols and our therapies. And it was very, very simple. It wasn't fancy. It was just answering the question in a very clear, concise way. And then we would have a very gentle sort of like light call to action. Click the button on the ad, learn more, watch our VSL, blah, blah, blah. So those worked incredibly well. And especially when we paired the pain point focus with this podcast style, those crushed. Lastly, we would have some social proof ads. So we didn't do these as much, again, just because of compliance, and we had to be very, very careful. But we would use some testimonials and before and after patient stories here and there as well. So creative testing, again, you can do all these things a million different ways, and you could do them really, really simply. You could do them in a really complicated way. I like simple because, again, simplicity scales. And, it's like we already had enough baked in complexity with the fact that we were managing $700,000 a month plus in ad spend with three different offers and multiple ad accounts. I didn't want to add more complexity than what we needed. So we kept our creative testing framework very, very simple. We would typically test 5 to 10 new creatives weekly, sometimes more, sometimes less, just depending on where we're at. Again, context is key here. Within the creative testing, we would typically kill anything out of KPI within 3 days. And that's why I much prefer with our media buyers that we always test at a slightly higher budget than what most people would normally go to, because I'd rather just get the data faster and make the decisions a lot faster. And then if we had any new tests that were 20% below KPI, let's say, for example, our KPI was this is just an example, like let's say it was a $200 cost per booked consult, and we had a new creative that was booking paid consults for $150 or $160, we would start scaling that new creative and typically get it into a new, an existing scaling campaign. And then lastly, we would typically refresh our winning creatives every 2 to 3 weeks. So again, this is new creative tests, new versions of the existing winners, different spins on them, maybe a different face, etc. So I want to briefly touch on compliance because, as I've mentioned before, it was one of our biggest issues and biggest roadblocks by far. Truthfully, it was probably the biggest fucking pain in the ass that we ran into all the time, honestly. And it was just part of the territory. It's just something you have to deal with when you're in an industry that's as delicate as this. So overall, the challenges were that you cannot make direct health claims. So I'll give you an example. You cannot say, hey, this supplement will cure your diabetes. That's not only a guaranteed way to get banned on Facebook, it's also a pretty damn good way to guarantee you get sued. So you can't do stuff like that. We also had the platforms, and specifically Facebook, constantly flagging our ads. We had this less on Google and YouTube, but it would happen from time to time. But Facebook was constantly flagging us. And even sometimes when we were fully compliant, and we would have, we would even talk to a Facebook rep, find out exactly what in the ads was flagging it. We would change it, remove it, and make it fully compliant. We would still get flagged just because of the nature of the ads themselves. And that was just something we had to contend with relatively constantly. The other challenge is that we would have to have our compliance team review everything before it went live. So that is like new copy, new images. Copy was obviously probably the biggest thing because it's literally like what we're saying. So that would also include new videos. Basically everything we wanted to roll out and test, we would have to get it reviewed for compliance first. And lastly, one wrong word literally could shut down our entire ad account. And unfortunately, there were a few occasions where that did happen. And again, it's just something we had to contend with. We did get better at compliance over time because we had to put a lot of focus into it, but it was still an ongoing issue. So let's talk budget management, because this is obviously a huge portion of buying media at this scale. Yes, we have the creatives and the messaging and the campaign architectures and all that stuff. And of course, that's crucial. But the higher level budget management strategy was also incredibly vital. So our typical daily budget allocation was roughly 23 grand a day in spend, and that was spread across 3 offers. Again, that would fluctuate depending on what we were spending for a given offer in a particular month. But on average, this is what it looked like. Now, the actual spend number was heavily driven by the sales teams for that particular offer. And what I mean by that is things like calendar availability, the sales team capacity. So if a new closer just came on board, or if one or two new closers just left the team. And then lastly, what the sales team was currently pacing as far as their unit goal and where they were at relative to it. Those three things all had a massive impact on what we would spend and how we would adjust our spend and our pace for that particular offer. Because again, we can't just blindly spend what we think we should spend on the marketing side. It's all incredibly intertwined with what's happening on the sales side of things. Now, when it came to what we tracked daily on our side for the marketing, here are the primary metrics we would look at. Obviously, we look at our cost per qualified app, and of course, the volume and amount per each of these. I just didn't want to, make a whole laundry list of a bunch of metrics. We would obviously look at our cost per booked consult. We would also look at show rates and our live call costs on these consults. This was one of the most important metrics. I've talked about this in other videos, but constantly evaluating the cost per a live phone call really gave us crystal clear insight into how the marketing and the sales was performing. Because looking at booked calls is one thing and cost per booked call is one thing, but having insight on what it actually costs to get somebody live on the phone, it just gives you a whole other layer of clarity, and it really allows us to much more effectively course correct as the month and the quarters went on. We would also, this is incredibly important, we would also look at our blended qualified opportunity cost. So what I mean by this is we had just a very standard call funnel for all three offers we were running traffic to. So we'd go ad to landing page. On that landing page, we'd have VSL application directly underneath. And then the application, if they were qualified, they would get rerouted to a booking page and then a thank you page. Now, people booking directly onto the calendar themselves was not the only way in which we had bookings, right? So we would have a large portion of our production came from the outbound SDRs, so the setters. And typically they would be outbound calling and texting people who filled out an application but didn't book. And then even people who filled out an application and the application said they were unqualified and they were DQ'd and didn't even have the option to book. But sometimes we would have people who either just didn't tell the truth on their application or selected the wrong answers by mistake, and actually they were qualified and we got them back on the calendar. So a lot of opportunity in production came from the setters. It was incredibly important for us to look at our blended cost per total qualified opportunity, which was again a mix of inbound direct ads bookings and bookings from setters and their outbound efforts, which would also be from those leads from ads and sometimes organic as well, but they're just two slightly different sort of sources of production, and we wanted to make sure we had insight on both of those. And because the problem is if you only look at one of those, if you only look at how much our cost per call was straight from ad to booking, that only gives you half the picture, and you do not want to optimize around that. And here's an example which actually takes me perfectly into the weekly rebalancing process. So every single week, we would have a dedicated call on the calendar to review all of our campaigns. And on that call, one of the core metrics we would look at was our total cost per qualified opportunity. And what was really interesting is we would often have campaigns where the cost per direct ads booking was sometimes 1.5 to 2x as high as our standard baseline KPI. But for whatever reason, and it could be the creatives, the messaging, the targeting, whatever, on that particular campaign, the setters were booking a significantly higher amount of calls from those leads in those applications. And therefore, the total blended cost per qualified opportunity on that one campaign was actually lower than on other campaigns where the cost per inbound front-end booking was lower. So that's why it's important that you look at the entire picture, not just one specific sort of micro part of the entire funnel ecosystem. So, and again, before I keep going into the weekly rebalancing process, I do just want to mention that we would obviously also look at revenue per dollar spent. So ROAS, right? Literally, it's at the end of the day, it's like MER and ROAS were the two biggest things. It's like, what are we spending? What's coming into the bank account for the business? So let's talk about the weekly rebalancing process. This was... I'm probably going to make another video where I go a lot more in depth on this. And if you would like to see that, by the way, feel free to let me know in the comments. But this was by far, and this might sound like a bit of a exaggeration here, but this process of weekly course correcting and adjusting based off of data and trends was by far the most crucial process that we installed that allowed us to manage all of this spend across the multiple ad accounts and multiple offers and creative depots, if you will. this process did it for us. And so what this process looked like at a high level was on Monday, we would review our weekend performance and then adjust budgets accordingly. And this would also include sales performance, of course. So much of what we did was so deeply intertwined with the sales teams and their pacings and their capacity, like I said. So it wasn't just about, oh, our front end metrics look good, we scale. Our front end metrics look bad, we decrease budget. It's not, that's, that's like level one. And then Wednesday is when we would do, typically when we would do our really, really in-depth audits that would take us, sometimes sometimes even 2 hours, just because we're looking through every single campaign of every single ad account for every offer and analyzing the trends and adjusting accordingly and mapping out the changes that we want to make, new tests, funnel tests, creative tests, etc. And then Friday is when we would plan the following week's tests and budget shifts. Again, sometimes we would adjust this process and execute sooner or execute less on a Wednesday or Thursday, just depending on where we're at. But generally speaking, this was the process. And as I've talked about in many of my other videos, we did our best. Again, we're human beings at the end of the day, so we're never going to be perfect. But I do think we did a really, really good job of not making emotional decisions and making as many of our decisions as we possibly could based on data. Again, we're not perfect, but this process really, really allowed us to do this. And so if you're not doing this currently inside your high ticket info business, highly recommend you start to do something of the sort. And then lastly, some budget shifting guidelines that we would follow. Again, I'm calling these guidelines because these were not hard rules. There was always nuance in this stuff, but generally speaking, if a campaign was in KPI for 3 to 5 days, we would scale up by 20%. And what I mean by that is we would scale the daily budget on that particular campaign by 20%, typically every 2 to 3 days, assuming it continued to stay within KPI. If a campaign was at a KPI for 3 or more days, we would usually reduce the budget on that campaign by 15 to 20%. And we typically tried to keep 10% of our total daily budget in reserve for just new opportunities, new testing, just kind of new random stuff, basically. Again, nuance here, but the other thing I wanted to touch on very, very briefly with regards to the budget shifting guidelines is we would see this all the time. So we would have campaigns where their front end metrics like cost per call, cost per application, et cetera, was high, say in the last 7 days. It was like 30, 40% higher than our baseline KPI where we knew we needed those campaigns to be. But the sales were actually coming in. This was incredibly common. So, and even more so on the higher time horizon. So if we'd zoom out to say 14 or even 30 days, we would see a campaign that's got significantly higher front end costs than our other campaigns, yet the quality was higher on those campaigns, and therefore the CPA and the ROAS and cash collected coming from those campaigns was much healthier than on others. So we really had to use our critical thinking, if you will, and critical judgment to not make decisions. Because here's the key, and this is probably the best way to wrap up this video. If you manage $100 or $700,000 a month and spend like a media buyer, you're going to be fucked. You're not going to be profitable. We had to manage $700,000 a month like 8-figure level CMOs and almost like portfolio managers for a financial advisory firm. Like we had to really look at the entire thing holistically. Again, media buyers tend to focus on drive down the front end metrics without looking at the entirety of the picture and the ecosystem. And, I think that the weekly rebalancing process combined with our ability to look at the entire picture, and when I say we, I mean the marketing team that I was running, really, really allowed us to consistently spend this much money on ads and maintain our profitability in front-end ROAS. So that's it for today's video. Hope you found this helpful. Again, if you are the founder of a high-ticket info business and you are stuck at a couple $100,000 a month, if you can't figure out why and you do not know what you need to do in order to scale past that level and break these bottlenecks, then I highly recommend that you go into the description of this video, pick up the free $1 Million a Month KPI dashboard. It's a free tool I've created that's going to give you 2 things. Number one, it's going to give you a very clean, clear snapshot of where your current marketing and sales metrics are at as of right now. And then secondly, inside that same spreadsheet, you're going to have a growth modeling tool that's going to allow you to map out exactly what needs to happen inside your business in order to hit your revenue targets. All you need to do is plug in your existing numbers and plug in your revenue target, and it will spit out all the numbers that you need to be hitting. So again, hope you found this video helpful. I cannot wait to see you in the next one.